Little vocabulary, prima facie. It's a good expression, Latin expression. You see it a lot, actually. Look these things up. I do. Prima facie, based on the first impression, accepted as correct until proved otherwise. Uh, Example, a prima facie case of professional misconduct. It's a good expression to have, I think. On a first look, I think of it. Something that seems to be true on the face of it, um, but could be, upon further inspection, further inquiry, could prove to be wrong. Um, how does it apply here to Ross? He uses the expression quite a bit. And about pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain are prima facie, pleasure is prima facie good. Pain is prima facie bad. Meaning that if all we know about a situation is that a human being is in pain, then prima facie that's bad. If all we know is that a human being is experiencing pleasure, on the face of it, that's good. But it could be proved otherwise. This is a way for him to deal with a problem that uh, he brings up on the idea that pleasure is an intrinsic, and pleasure in the absence of pain are intrinsic goods. This is on page 144 in the second column. There is also another set of facts which cast doubt on the view that pleasure is always good and pain always bad. We have decided conviction that there are bad pleasures, and though this is less obvious, that there are good pains. We think that the pleasure taken either by the agent or by a spectator in, for instance, a lustful or cruel action is bad. And we think it is good that people should be pained rather than pleased by contemplating vice or misery. So there are, again, to say that pleasure is intrinsically good and pain is intrinsically bad, that needs to be qualified, because we all would agree that there are bad pleasures and perhaps good pains. How does he solve this? Well, I think in a rather sort of common sense way. This is the bottom of 144. Thus, the view that pleasure is always good and pain always bad, while it seems to be strongly supported by some of our convictions, seems to be equally strongly opposed by others. The difficulty can, I think, be removed by ceasing to speak simply of pleasure and pain as good or bad, and by asking more carefully what it is that we mean. Consideration of the question is aided if we adopt the view that what is good or bad is always something properly expressed by a that clause. That is, it's good that, it's bad that. That is an objective, or as I shall prefer to call it, a fact. If we look at the matter thus, I think we can agree that the fact that a sentient being is in a state of pleasure is always in itself good, and the fact that a sentient being is in a state of pain is always in itself bad, when this fact is not an element in a more complex fact having some other characteristic relevant to goodness or badness. That is, again, on the face of it, prima facie, being in a state of pleasure is good, and prima facie, being in a state of pain is bad, unless this fact that someone is in a state of pleasure or pain is not an element in a more complex fact, having some other characteristic relevant to good or badness, goodness or badness. And his example here is an example of deserved or deserving. I mean, the fact that somebody is in a state of pleasure is prima facie good. But if that fact is part of a larger complex of facts where other moral characteristics or other moral issues or something of other moral relevance comes in, then it may turn out not to be true. Um, he says here, this is page 145, but when a moral being is feeling a pleasure or pain that is deserved or undeserved, or pleasure or pain that implies a good or a bad disposition, the total fact is quite inadequately described if we say a sentient being is feeling pleasure or pain. The total fact may be that a sentient or moral being is feeling a pleasure that is undeserved or that is a realization of a vicious disposition. For instance, if the person is taking pleasure in bringing about pain to someone else, that would be the total fact, and we would judge that that pleasure is not good. So he says, pleasure seems indeed to have a property analogous to that which we have previously recognized under the name of conditional or prima facie rightness. An act of promise keeping has the property not necessarily of being right, but of being something that is right if the act has no other morally significant characteristic. That is, I mean, if you think about Kant said we always have to keep our promises. We can never lie. So the fact that somebody lies is prima facie evil, prima facie bad. But if it's part of a larger complex of facts, if that person is lying in order to save an innocent person's life, then we would have to reevaluate our initial judgment, which is a prima facie one, that is evil. And I think that this is pretty much, yeah, he's got to be right. I mean, there's almost nothing that is always good to do, and there's almost nothing that is always bad to do. There are always some situations in which we would have to reevaluate the goodness or badness depending upon circumstances. And he does mention the undeserved pleasure or undeserved pain. Let's say that we talk about somebody who commits a terrible crime and then is incarcerated and experiences the pain of confinement. On the prima facie, that person's experiencing pain, so it's bad. But if we connect it with the larger complex of facts, that they're experiencing that pain of confinement because something terrible they did to another human being, then we would not say that that pain, looked at, in the whole context of what's going on, is it's a deserved pain, you might say. So he adds a third type of good there on page 145 in the second column. 3, as a third independent good, the apportionment of pleasure and pain to the virtuous and the vicious, respectively. And it is on the recognition of this as a separate good that the recognition of the duty of justice, in distinction from fidelity to promises on the one hand and from beneficence on the other, rests. That is, that's why the third type of good is really about justice. Who deserves what? I suppose we would say it was a better universe in which pleasure and pain were distributed in some way according to desert, so that we must think that justice, the apportionment of pleasure and pain to the virtuous and the vicious, respectively, is a third type of good. The last type of good, number 4, which he introduces at the bottom of page 145, is knowledge, and that's an interesting one. Again, he asks us to do the thought experiment. Here, too, he says, we may, if we please, help ourselves to realize the fact by supposing 2 states of the universe, equal in respect of virtue and of pleasure, and of the allocation of pleasure to the virtuous, but such that the persons in the one had a far greater understanding of the nature and laws of the universe than those in the other. Can anyone doubt that the first would be a better state of the universe? Basically saying, again, if we imagine in our thought experiment 2 separate universes, one in which that were completely equal in terms of the distribution of pleasure and pain, but one in which people understood the nature and laws of the universe and the other ones didn't, would we have any reason for preferring one over the other? And he says, well, of course we would prefer the one in which people understood reality. They understood the truth about reality, irrespective of pleasure and pain. That's an interesting one. And this is his method, as he indicates, that he asks us to consult our intuitions about things, and he thinks that our intuitions about these things have some authority, that they give us some insight into the truth of things. Now, of course, there are objections to this too. Sometimes some kinds of knowledge are trivial. As he says, knowledge of the number of stories in a building, or knowledge of the batting average of, the Detroit Tigers in 1926. It's just doesn't seem to be very important. There are, of course, more important things to have knowledge about. But he says even those trivial things, we would say, well, they do have value. Some value, just not as much as other things. Knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem is much more important than knowledge of Ty Cobb's batting average when he was playing for the Tigers. Lifetime batting average of 366 now, or 367. That's pretty good, Ty Cobb, but still trivial. But still, it's worth knowing. If you think that everything is worth knowing. He also deals with the objection that there's some things that we positively don't want to know. We'd be better off not knowing, which is, I think, a stickier problem. He says here on 146, there is another objection which may naturally be made to the view that knowledge as such is good. There are many pieces of knowledge which we in fact think it well for people not to have. For example, we may think it a bad thing for a sick man to know how ill he is, or for a vicious man to know how he may most conveniently indulge his vicious tendencies. But it seems that in such cases, it is not the knowledge, but the consequences in the way of pain or vicious action that we think bad. That's interesting. I don't know if that's really an adequate response to it, but I guess he's making this, again, the distinction between having the knowledge and what occurs from the knowledge. The knowledge itself is good. It's the consequences that may be bad, but that doesn't seem, that's a complicated thing. But in any case, interesting essay, or interesting thing, the idea of knowledge pluralism, that it would be a mistaken road to think that any one type of thing is the only good. There are various goods, and he has pointed out 4. And my guess is that that's incomplete. He said virtuous disposition to action, pleasure, justice, and knowledge are the goods. And he suggests at the end that all other goods are made up of them as elements. That seems to be a little bit ambitious. As he says here at the end, of the 3 elements, virtue, knowledge, and pleasure are compounded all the complex states of mind that we think good in themselves. So those are what he's identifying as the elements. All the things in the world that we think good are made up of some combination of them. Now, that's an interesting thesis. I wonder if you could ever really have a complete list. I don't know.